and welcome to Consulting Ninja. I'm excited to have you guys here today. I'm going to be doing a tutorial on JavaScript for beginners. If you are new here, thanks for popping in and checking this out. If you guys find this helpful, give a like and subscribe, comment below, hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of the next video. In order to make this simple, all you guys need to follow along is a browser. We will head to w3schools.com. And then we're going to scroll down to this JavaScript section and click Try It Yourself. This is a pretty handy little environment where we have an HTML document that has a script inside, and we can modify this, click the Run button, and the result will be rendered over here. Now, there's many different ways, many different development environments. This one is the easiest and lowest barrier to entry to just get in and get started. I am operating from a place of you guys already know what JavaScript is, as far as JavaScript is a front end, meaning this is a language, a scripting language that we use to create functionality in a web setting, an online setting, and there is a back-end version. It's called Node.js, and it's where essentially where you have JavaScript available to run on a server somewhere. We're not getting into that today. That will be another video, which will be super fun. So stick around for that someday. But today we're doing JavaScript for browsers, JavaScript in an HTML document, which is primarily what you're going to be doing. So with all that aside, the first thing that I want to talk about is let's just talk about containers. Let's talk about variables. In order to do anything with JavaScript, or in order to do anything meaningful with JavaScript, you have to understand what a variable is. And what all a variable is a named space, a named container, a memory address, however you want to think about it, where we can store a value. And that value can be anything. It can be numbers, right? It can be characters, or it can be other variables. It can even be functions, and I'll show you guys that later. But to start, there's a few different ways that we create a variable. And the most common way, well, the two most common ways nowadays are if a value is never going to change in your program, you'd use this word const, and then whatever name you'd like to choose. This is totally up to you. It just can't have any spaces in it. So you'd choose a variable name like this. And then if you are doing a const, you have to give it a value right away. So we'll say constant value. So now I have created a variable. It is a constant variable whose value is always going to be the string constant space value. Now, there are several different ways to create a string and store it in a variable. This is single quotes. You can also use double quotes, or my favorite, the string literal notation, which is the backtick, like backwards single quote button. It's also the tilde button. It should be underneath your escape key. And this is my favorite because it allows us to do some cool stuff when we want to add two different strings together and put spaces in between them, and use other variables to populate sections of that string. This is a really nice way to do all that stuff easily. So if that's how you'd create a constant variable with the string value constant value inside of that. If this were something that would possibly change in your program, then you would use this keyword let, and that's telling JavaScript, hey, I'm creating this variable, and I'm starting it off with this value, but maybe some point down the road I'm going to put something else in there. So I'm not. It's not a constant value. It may change. It doesn't have to. It's allowed to be changed later. That's not the case with a constant. So that is a general of the basic variables, the two ways to create them. These values also could be what's called an array, which is a container that holds multiple values. And in order, if we wanted to create an array of values, you'd do something very similar, except for you'd put brackets around here, around the value. And that's, JavaScript is a loosely typed language. What that means is, in other languages, you have to be very specific in the kind of data you're storing in your variables. JavaScript, that is not the case. You can get very loosey-goosey, and JavaScript will figure it out at runtime, what you're trying to do, and will make it work. That's why people created the TypeScript language, which actually sits on top of JavaScript and forces people to be specific with what values, what kinds of values, what data structures they're using in their applications. It's a way of improving development, a way of improving your development environment so that you can get IntelliSense, which is where your the application that you're using to write your code will tell you, give you suggestions as to what you might be trying to do when you press your keys. And that's something I'll get into at a later video. We want to keep this very basic for this video, and so we're not going to get into any of the IDE stuff. That's why we're just running this in the browser, make it easy for you guys. So with that said, JavaScript is a loosely typed language. We do not have to be very explicit in what kinds of data we are storing in this variable. So we just put brackets around here, and now if we were to reference this variable later on in our application, JavaScript will just kind of know based off of these brackets that this is an array, and it's an array with one item inside of it, and that item is the string value. Now, if we wanted multiple values inside here, we would put a comma and then the next value. So value 1, comma, and the next value, value 2. And arrays are indexed starting at 0. And what that means is, if I wanted to do something in my application with this string that says value, I would have to reference variable name like this, and then we say we have these brackets again, and you're saying I want to access this array, and I want to access the first container in that array. Well, the first container is actually the 0 place, and so that's something that throws people off when they're first starting. The first value in a variable is not the first place, it's not number 1. The first index, it's called, is index 0. And so if we wanted to, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys, we're gonna add this document.write, and we're going to place this inside of here. Now, don't worry about what document.write is for now. Just go ahead and put that in there and then click run. And you'll see that here now says value. That's the string in that first place. It's being written right into the document using this special piece of code right there. And so if we wanted to access this value in this array, which is the second value, but it's the index number 1, then we replace that with 1 and hit run, and you'll see it prints out value 1. And the second index number is accessing the third value. So if you hit run, it'll print out value 2. So that's a basic string array. We also could put these in numbers. We could put 1, and let's do that just to show you. There's no problem here. JavaScript, loosely typed, doesn't even care if you have the same kind of value inside of your array. You can store a mishmash, a hodgepodge, however you like it, just throw it in there. I will warn against doing stuff like this, though. This is what would be considered poor programming practices, and the reason why would be anybody else that's inside of your application is not going to know that an array is having mixed data types inside of it. Usually when you need to store values of different kinds, you would create an object. And what an object is, well, pretty much everything in JavaScript is an object. The document is an object, and that is what allows us to do this .write. So inside of JavaScript, when you're accessing a document is a special keyword for JavaScript, and it is the document object model representation. And a thorough explanation of document object model, you guys can find that in the reference section. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that. I just wanted to point out what is going on here, and so you know what's going on. But the document is an object representation of the document object model, which is this our HTML document. And one of the properties that object has is a method called write, or a function. It has a special function that writes, and what it's doing is writing the document. Now, if you were to use this after the entire thing had been rendered, this actually would erase the whole document and render out just this. So I would caution against using this in your actual development, but it is helpful for our purposes, because we can quickly see values that we're needing to see. So back to objects. Object, let's create an object. So I'm going to say let object. So there's, as I'm typing this, I'll say there are certain objects that are special objects in JavaScript, and then there's what I'm doing here, which is a user-defined object. So I'm going to define an object, and let's just say that my object has a name, and the name is Bob. And it has an age, and the age is 1. We'll do 18. And you could also do these don't have to be simple data types. These values could be complex data types. You could say you could give this data property of object a whole nother object inside of that, and then say that has a dog breed lab and dog age 10. And you could do an array. It does not have to be simple. So you can have an object, and the object can be as complicated as you want to make it. And let me tell you from experience in industry that in industry there are some extremely complex objects representing data of all different kinds that you need to be able to access and manipulate and update. So there's lots of different ways to do all that stuff. But just wanted to show you guys what it looks like to create an object. So if we wanted to access this object, we can just put that in here. And I don't actually know if, in the console you can print out an entire object, and it will display it something like this, so you can open up each section and see what's inside. Looks like this is not that friendly. So let's access something directly. And so type in object, and then dot, and then whatever thing you want to access. So you pick. We could do name, and now it's going to print out Bob. We could do age. Now it's going to print out 18. And then we could access data. Well, data is an object. So if we do this, we're going to get that object again. So let's be specific in what property of that data object we want to access, and let's say dog breed. Oops. And if I run that, you see lab. And if I change this to age, dog age, and hit run, you see 10. So that's how we access properties on an object that we create. And that's the same way as I'm doing here with this object, the document object. I'm accessing with the dot, and write is a function. So in order to kind of show you guys what's going on here, so before I proceed with the next bit that I was going to show you, and that is assigning functions as properties of objects, let's define what a function is. So a function is a set amount of code statements that you want to give a name, like you name variables, and that you might want to run more than once in your application. You can instantiate or declare a function a few different ways. One of the common is the function and then give it the name just like you would a variable. We'll just call it my function, and opening, closing parenthesis, and opening and closing brackets. And then everything that you have in between these brackets is the statement, the code that the code statements that will run when you actually execute this function. And you can execute a function by typing out, by calling its name, and then opening, closing parenthesis like that. And I'll show you that in a second. But that's what a function is. It's chunks of code that we're giving a name that we probably want to use more than once in our application. In industry, I've actually found this to be probably the least likely way a function would be instantiated or declared. Most often we declare functions like this. We would say const my function is assigned, and then what this is, there's a few different names for this. Some people call it a fat arrow function, inline function. There's a few different names for it, but we'll just call it a ES6 function. Essentially what it is an anonymous function. That's how I refer to it, an anonymous function. And as I was showing with this example, what we're doing here is the value that we're storing in this constant variable is a function that doesn't have a name, although it's accessed using the variable that's holding it. So in this situation, it does have a name. So, sorry if that's confusing, but an anonymous function stored to a variable, and we would run this the same way we would a function. We just say my function, opening, closing parenthesis, and then the code that's inside of here, just like a normal function would run. So that is another way. That's a very common way of creating functions in industry, I've found, in my own personal experience. So now that we know what a function is, let's go ahead and let's assign one to this property of object called fun. And fun, I guess we can just say that that's short for function, or just because programming is fun and functions are fun. So there, it's all fun. It's all good. So what we would do in here, you can do this inside of your object. You can do this the same two ways that I showed you. You can just type out function. Well, you can't name it, I don't think. Let me know in the comments if you can. You can say function and then like this and put your code in here. For readability's sake, in industry, we always just do the anonymous function, the fat arrow function, like this. And what I'm going to do in here is I am going to let's just do an example of how would you guys like to see me modifying the HTML that we have over here. I'm primarily trying to stick to basic JavaScript functionality because this is kind of like the old school way of doing things, and in industry you're probably going to be using a framework which looks much different than what we're seeing here. So I want you to be more comfortable with the concepts of the basic concepts that would be similar So variables, objects, storing functions in objects. There's actually a line of thinking that says that you should assign your functions to an object property to prevent what's called namespace collisions. And that just means that in our script, in our JavaScript file, you can't have something called, we couldn't reuse, we couldn't redeclare later on let variable name and assign it something else, right? We can't do this. You've already used that name to declare a container. Now, because this is a let, which means we can overwrite it, you can just overwrite what's in there. However, that starts to get confusing for people. So that's one of the reasons why we have this, let and const. If you're going to be changing a value, you would use the let. But in my experience, you really don't want to be doing that because other people that are viewing your code might not understand what's going on. So it's usually the case that rather than changing what's inside of a container, this would be a constant. And then if you needed to modify something inside of there or create a new value based off of this information, you're going to do something in your program, you would create another constant, and we'll just call this like updated value. And then what you would assign would be like, variable name. Let's say we just wanted the first two out of here, and we'll grab the second one. And the reason why, as I'm typing this out, the reason why we do this is the same reason why people use TypeScript. Because people make mistakes, I make mistakes, you're going to make mistakes, so get used to that, be okay with that. But this is a way to prevent mistakes from being made, or not to prevent them from being made really, but to know quickly that a mistake was made. Because if you try to run the previous example where I was redeclaring the same name, the program would error out. You'd get an error and say, hey, you can't do that. And the same thing would be true if you tried to change a value for a constant variable. So if I declared this variable name and then later on tried to rewrite what was in there with something else, it would not let me do that. It would say, hey, that's a constant, you can't do that. And that's to prevent mistakes. So we oftentimes create constants and then just create new constants off of the old ones. And so to show you, I'll just print one of these values, updated value, and then we'll just put sub0. And that just means I'm going to we're going to write out to the document the first value inside of this array that we created by pulling out two values out of the first array. And you'll see that it prints value because that was the first value in that array. And then if I did 1, it would be value 1. And if usually you'd be doing something with this, so you probably would be like, and I'll show you this backtick string literal that I was describing to you earlier, because this is super helpful and something that you do a lot. So let's say that we wanted to take one of these values and create a new value based off of that value. In this case, we're working with strings, and so we would use this string literal to create a new value. And to access this value inside of this string, we put it in the backticks, the string literal backticks, and then we do $, curly bracket, $, curly bracket, and then you can add whatever you want. So you could do my old value is, and then when we run this, when I run that, you see my old value is value. And so you see why I like that string literal way of representing strings, is it allows us to be able to quickly modify them later on, and add spaces, include variables inside of them. It's just a really nice way of doing that. So, but this is why you typically would not see let used a ton. There is another older way that's been deprecated called var, but we won't even get into that. Don't use it. So that's why, is to prevent any sort of programming mistakes on yours or the part of the next programmer that's working in the area you've been. So I hope that makes sense. So now that we've talked about that, let's get back to our function. We are assigning a function to the fun property of the object called object. And now inside here, what I'm going to do is, let's do a little example with modifying our HTML. And I will say let element, and element being HTML element. And then we're going to use a different document attribute called get element by ID. And as you probably guessed, this is a special function it's a property. Just like fun is a property of object, get element by ID is a property of document. And just like fun is a function, get element by ID is a function. So I'm using this built-in document object, and I'm using, of that document object, I'm using the property, which is a function, get element by ID. And as you probably noticed, I've typed in demo here, which correlates to this ID up here. So this is the way of accessing HTML elements in your document by using the document object, model representation object, and then accessing, and there's different ways of grabbing elements. You can grab by ID, you can grab, there's a few other of these special functions that we can use. But for our purposes, we have the ID there, let's use that. And then let's say we wanted to update the text there. Let's say element. And then this HTML element has a text content property, which, as you guessed, is the text that's inside of it. So if I then change it to, so I'm not changing, I'm assigning it. So I say, hey, go to the document, use this method to find this element in our HTML document and store it inside of this container. And then once I have that object representation of that element, I can access its properties, one of them being the text that is inside of it. And if I run this, you'll see nothing happens, because even though I have this function here, it's inside of this object, and we've not actually executed it, like I said earlier, where you have to say, you know, object.fun parentheses. Now, this is not going to be super fancy, but there you have it. We have declared a function, we've assigned it to the property of this object, and then we've executed the function by saying, hey, object, go to your fun property and execute the function there. And so it does. And what our function inside of there does is go to the document and search for the ID in this HTML document of demo, and then once it has it, it reassigns the text that it has to gotcha. Got that element. You did it. Yeah. Now there's cooler ways of demonstrating this probably. Let me show you a couple other things that people may not know. So there's a few different ways of making buttons on a web page. You can use button like this and then put text inside of here and then close that HTML tag off, and you'll see that there's now a button here. One of the ways that I actually prefer, it's a little less code, is doing an input and type equals button. And let's give this a value. The value, when you're using the input way of creating a button, the value is the text that's displayed. So if I say my button here, ID button. So if I say my button inside a value for an input, that's the text that will be displayed, just like when you use button and put the text inside. So little short little HTML sidetrack there, but pretty cool. So to create a on-click handler, there's a few different ways of doing that. And I just want to show this because this is something that's super common to do. Inside of your HTML element, you can say on-click, and then what you put in here is a function that you want to run. And so in this case, it would be object.fun. And if I run this, now you'll see nothing happens. But if I click my button, it runs the function that we've defined inside of the object.fun property. So that's pretty cool. You also can assign a click handler using a special document method, and I'll show this, and that's document dot, and we're going to use that get element by ID, and we're going to find the button. So what element we want to find is button. And then once we found button, we want to add an event listener. And the kind of event we're listening for is a click. Now, there are other things that you can do here. There's other ways of getting the button, and there's other things that you can add. You also can remove, and there's also other types of events. So you could do on mouse over, on mouse off, on keyboard down, on key up. There's all kinds of them, but what we want is the click here. Now, what I'm going to show you is hopefully going to be helpful to you. But let's say I put object.fun here, just like that, and then I close this off, and we run this. You'll see that this is immediately happening. When the code gets there, it is immediately executed because we told it to immediately execute, right? That's what happens when you have, that's how you execute a function. You type out the name, or in this case, access the property with those parentheses, and it says, hey, run that code. So if you're doing this method, you have to assign it an anonymous function. And then what that does is prevents it from being executed. So it's executing this function that's returning that function when we click it. Hope that makes sense. So then when I click the button, we have the result we're looking for. So this has been a very quick tutorial on JavaScript. I hope that you find this helpful. We've covered variables, we've talked about arrays a little bit, objects and functions. Those are kind of the basic building blocks for JavaScript. I hope that everyone has enjoyed this video. If you have, give a like and subscribe, thumbs up, comment below with any questions, or head to my website, consultingninja.tech, where I have compiled lists of resources that have helped me in development, and hopefully you would find those helpful as well. Hit the notification bell if you want to see the next video. I am going to be talking about frameworks, which would be taking this to the next level. Have a great day.